The boardroom on the 32nd floor of the Caldwell Morrow Tower in downtown Toronto had floor-to-soiling windows that looked out over Lake Ontario. And on a clear morning in late October, the water looked almost silver, flat and cold and indifferent, the kind of view designed to make whatever happened inside the room feel permanent, like a decision made in front of that window would somehow carry the same weight as the city itself. Seth Garland didn't care about the view. He was 41 years old, a single father, and the founder of a supply chain logistics company called BridgePath Solutions that had spent the last 6 years quietly becoming something no one in this room had fully expected. Necessary. Not flashy, not disruptive in the way that got magazine covers, but deeply, structurally necessary to the kind of mid-market manufacturers and distribution networks that kept the country running behind the scenes. And now, 5 members of the Aldercroft Group, one of the oldest family-controlled investment conglomerates in the country, were sitting across from him in tailored wool and careful expressions. And on the table between them sat a document that someone had clearly spent a lot of time making look inevitable. The number on the first page was $4.2 million. Seth had read the whole thing twice before anyone in the room said a word. And the longer he read, the more clearly he understood what the document actually was, because it wasn't an acquisition offer. It was a transfer of identity. A rebranding clause buried in page 11. A governance restructure in page 17 that reduced the founder's role to an advisory position with no operational authority. A non-compete that extended 48 months and covered every sector BridgePath had ever touched or planned to touch. They weren't buying his company. They were folding it into theirs and keeping the parts that were useful and discarding the rest, including him. Across the table, the man at the center of it all was Reginald Aldercroft, 70 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that came from spending a lifetime in rooms where other people were nervous. He had a way of looking at Seth that felt like appraisal, like someone deciding how much something was worth at a garage sale rather than a boardroom. Beside him sat his son, Marcus, the one the family had decided would be the face of the next generation, and 2 advisors who hadn't introduced themselves and didn't need to. And then there was Constance Aldercroft, Reginald's wife, who hadn't looked at Seth once since he walked in. She was studying her phone with a kind of pointed disinterest that was almost theatrical. "You've been efficient," Reginald said finally, lacing his fingers together on the table. "I'll give you that. What you've built is functional. It solved a real problem. But functionality without scale is just a ceiling, and you've been hitting yours for 2 years." He paused, letting that land. "Men who build what you've built, at the pace you've built it, they tend to peak. It's not a criticism. It's just the pattern." Someone across the table made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. Seth didn't respond immediately. He had learned a long time ago that the pause before you speak is where other people reveal what they actually think of you. And Reginald Aldercroft filled that pause by straightening his jacket and glancing at his son like he was already moving on to the next item on the agenda. And that was when Seth felt it. Not anger exactly, but something quieter and more clarifying. The specific exhaustion of being misread. Because the story they had built about him in this room, the scrappy founder who had run out of ceiling, had very little to do with him and everything to do with what they needed him to believe, so he'd sign without asking too many questions. He set the document down and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not for his phone, not yet, but his hand brushed it as he did, and for half a second his thoughts went somewhere else entirely. To a kitchen in Mississauga. To a Tuesday morning 2 weeks ago when he had been making toast and his daughter, Rosie, had come downstairs with her backpack already on, ready for school 40 minutes early, because she had a presentation and she was nervous. And she had stood at the counter eating cereal while he reviewed the slides with her one more time, and at the end she had looked up at him and said, very seriously, "Dad, I think you make things clearer, not smarter, clearer." He hadn't forgotten that. He looked back up. "Tell me," Seth said, his voice even, "what you're actually offering." Reginald's expression didn't change. $4.2 million. "We've been clear." "I read the document," Seth said. "Twice. What I'm asking is what you think you're buying, because based on pages 11 and 17, it isn't a company. It's a client list and a software license." He kept his voice calm, almost conversational. "The rest of it, the operational architecture, the team, the relationships that took 6 years to build, that disappears under your rebrand in about 8 months. I've seen how your acquisitions work." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Constance Aldercroft finally looked up from her phone. Marcus leaned forward, his voice carrying just enough warmth to be insulting. "Seth, you're being defensive about something that's actually good news for you. This is generational wealth. You can walk away and take care of your He glanced down at a file, like he needed to check, "Your daughter. Set her up. Focus on what matters." And there it was. Seth looked at Marcus for a moment without speaking. Then he closed the document. The sound of it was small and ordinary, but in that room at that moment it was the clearest thing he had said since sitting down. "Then we don't have a deal," Seth said. He said it without heat, without drama, in the same tone he might use to say it looked like rain. "Because what you're describing isn't a sale, it's a dissolution, and I didn't build Bridgepath to dissolve it." He gathered his copy of the document and stood. Reginald's composure didn't crack, but something shifted behind his eyes, the particular calculation of a man who had just been told no and was already deciding what to do about it. "You're leaving $4 million on the table," he said. "I'm leaving your $4 million on the table," Seth replied. "Mine's still in the company," and he walked out. The elevator down to the lobby was empty, and Seth stood in it with his jacket open, and his eyes on the brushed metal doors, and his heart going at a pace he was pretending not to notice. The thing about making a decision that costs you something real is that it doesn't feel like strength right away. It just feels like the moment after you've jumped, and you're waiting to find out how far down the ground is. His phone buzzed twice before he reached the lobby. Then 3 more times in the revolving door. Outside, the October air hit him like something honest, sharp and cold, and smelling faintly of the lake. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment while the city moved around him. Streetcars, construction noise, a food truck with a lineup despite the weather, and he thought about $4.2 million. He thought about what it would mean to not have to worry about payroll for the next 18 months. He thought about the team meeting on Thursday. He thought about Rosie's hockey registration and the fact that his furnace was 12 years old and making a sound it hadn't been making in September. He thought about the way Marcus had looked at his file before saying the word daughter. Then his phone lit up with a notification from Rosie's school. A photo her teacher had uploaded to the parent portal, a craft project, some kind of papier-mâché thing painted in green and yellow that was apparently meant to be a bridge. Rosie's name was on it in marker in her large, careful printing. Beneath the photo, the teacher had written, "Rosie told us her dad builds bridges that help people find each other." Seth stood on the sidewalk outside the Aldercroft Tower and looked at that photo for a long time. Then he put his phone in his pocket and walked toward his car. The drive home felt longer than it was. The highway into Mississauga was moving well for that time of day, but Seth barely noticed. His mind kept cycling back through the meeting, not the outcome, but the details. The way Reginald had said functional like it was almost a compliment. The way Marcus had said generational wealth like he was doing Seth a favor. The way Constance hadn't looked at him for the first 40 minutes and then couldn't stop once he'd pushed back. He had done the right thing. He was almost certain he had done the right thing. Almost. He pulled into the driveway at 4:15. Rosie wasn't home yet. Her aunt picked her up on days like this when Seth had meetings that ran long, and the house had that specific quality of silence that he had come to know well over the past 7 years of doing this alone. The kind that held its breath until she walked through the door. He put a kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened his laptop. The emails had already started. Not from the Aldercrofts, not yet, but from his team. His operations lead, a sharp and perpetually tired woman named Petra, had sent a message that read simply, "Heard it didn't go. Call when you're ready." His head of client relations had forwarded a news alert. Some industry reporter had apparently been tipped off, because there was already a single paragraph online about a failed acquisition meeting between Aldercroft Group and Bridgepath Solutions. Nothing accurate, nothing detailed, just enough to start the clock on people asking questions. And then, just as the kettle clicked off, his phone rang. It was Aldercroft's legal team. They were very polite. They wanted to let him know, as a courtesy, that there were some time-sensitive business relationships that Aldercroft Group had been facilitating on Bridgepath's behalf. Introductions, really, nothing formal, and that given the change in circumstances, those relationships might need to be reassessed. The woman on the phone had a pleasant voice and was clearly reading from something someone had prepared in advance. Seth thanked her, hung up, and sat with his tea going cold in front of him. He understood what was happening. The Aldercrofts hadn't survived 70 years in the industry by losing gracefully. They had a long memory and a longer reach, and what they couldn't control through acquisition, they were apparently willing to manage through attrition. The front door opened. "Dad?" Rosie was 8 years old, and she came into the kitchen the way she always did. Backpack still on, shoes not yet off too much to tell him to bother with logistics. She dropped her bag at the edge of the kitchen and came to the table and looked at his face with the focused attention that always made him feel slightly X-rayed. "You have your thinking look," she said. "I had a big meeting today." She climbed into the chair across from him and pulled her knees up. Was it the important one? Did it go okay? Seth turned his mug in a slow circle. It was complicated. Rosie nodded as though this was a completely satisfying answer, which from her it probably was. She reached into her backpack and produced a slightly crumpled piece of paper, a drawing done in pencil and then colored with what appeared to be every marker she owned simultaneously, and slid it across the table to him. It was a bridge, wide and solid with stick figures crossing it in both directions. On one side of the bridge she had drawn a building with a Canadian flag on top. On the other side, a house with a tree in front of it. "I made one at school too," she said. "The teacher put it up. I saw it," he told her. "The photo on the parent app." She grinned, that gap-toothed grin she'd had since the summer, the one she'd been self-conscious about for 2 weeks and then had apparently decided was actually quite good. "Do you like it? It's the best bridge I've seen today," he said, completely sincerely. She seemed satisfied with that and went to get a snack, and Seth looked at the drawing for a long moment because something about it. The house on one side, the building on the other, the figures crossing in both directions, felt like it was trying to say something he needed to hear. He had built Bridgepath the same way, not as an empire, not as a legacy project, not as something to sell, as a connection. A way for the people who made things to find the people who needed them, and to do it without losing themselves in the process. The Aldercrofts hadn't understood that. They had looked at his company and seen an asset. They had looked at him and seen a ceiling. But the bridge wasn't the asset. The bridge was the point. The next morning was hard in the specific way that mornings after big decisions tend to be. The adrenaline had cleared, and what was left was just the clear, cold shape of the consequences. Petra had called him at 7:30, and he had been honest with her. They had talked for 40 minutes about what the Aldercroft pressure campaign might look like, which partners might be vulnerable to it, and what the runway looked like if 2 of their pending deals fell through. The runway was not comfortable. It was not catastrophic, but it was not comfortable. He dropped Rosie at school. She had waved without turning around, already absorbed in a conversation with her friend before she reached the gate, and then drove back downtown for the first of 3 meetings that would define the next 48 hours. His lawyer, his accountant, and a contact at a firm called Lakeshore Capital who had reached out 6 months ago and been told politely that Seth wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. He was ready now. The thing about building a company the way Seth had built Bridgepath, from nothing on no family money, carrying a daughter on a hip while writing code at a kitchen table at midnight, is that you learn to see the structure of things, where the weight is actually resting, which connections are load-bearing, and which ones just look important from the outside. And what Seth had never shown the Aldercrofts, what he had never shown anyone outside his core team, was the architecture he had been building quietly for the past 18 months alongside the main product. It was an integration layer, a proprietary system that allowed mid-market manufacturers to connect their supply chains in real time across what had traditionally been incompatible software environments. It worked in a way that the 3 or 4 large-scale competitors in the space had been trying to solve for years and hadn't. Seth's team had cracked it through a combination of approaches that no one had thought to try, because no one else had been small enough and close enough to the problem for long enough to understand where the actual friction was. He had been waiting to release it until the legal protections were in order and the right partnerships were in place. The Aldercrofts had pushed him into releasing it sooner. He spent the next 2 days in meetings he didn't publicize and phone calls he didn't log. He talked to 3 manufacturers he had relationships with in Ontario and Alberta who had been waiting for exactly this kind of solution, and who, when he explained what it could do, went quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when they realize they've been looking for something for a long time and it's just been described to them. He talked to a logistics software firm in British Columbia that he had been circling for a year, and that was now suddenly very interested in a formal conversation. He talked to Lakeshore Capital for 90 minutes and walked out with a term sheet that was structured entirely differently from anything the Aldercrofts had offered. No governance clauses, no rebranding requirements, no non-compete that swallowed his professional existence whole. He didn't tell his team everything. He told them enough. By the end of the second day, Petra had stopped looking at him with the particular expression she reserved for situations she was professionally obligated to manage, but personally thought were disasters, and had started looking at him with the expression she reserved for when she suspected she had been wrong about something, and was recalibrating. On the 3rd evening, his phone rang with an unknown number that turned out to be a direct line to Marcus Aldercroft. The conversation was brief. Marcus started it with the same tone he had used in the boardroom, smooth, a little warm, a little condescending, and ended it with a tone Seth had not heard from him before, which was something much closer to straightforward. "My father would like to meet again," Marcus said. "I know," Seth said. A pause. "You've been busy." "So have you," Seth replied. "Most of it didn't work." Another pause, longer this time. "The integration layer, how long have you had it?" Seth didn't answer that. He didn't need to. "What would it take?" Marcus said finally, dropping the warmth entirely and speaking in a register that Seth found actually much easier to deal with. "To get back to the table?" Seth leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his home office. The water stain in the corner he'd been meaning to deal with since spring, the framed photo of Rosie at age 4 at the splash pad, the whiteboard covered in diagrams that only made sense if you had been in the room when they were made. "Different terms," Seth said. "Partnership, not acquisition. Minority stake only. Full operational authority stays with me, and your team never contacts my partners directly again. That part's non-negotiable." The silence on the other end of the line had a different quality than the silences in the boardroom. It wasn't strategic. It was someone doing an actual calculation. "I'll bring it to my father," Marcus said. "I'm sure you will," Seth said, and ended the call. He sat in the chair for a minute without moving. Then he went downstairs. Rosie was at the kitchen table working on homework, her pencil moving in slow, careful strokes across a page of long division. She didn't look up when he came in, which meant she was concentrating, which meant he should not interrupt her, which he had learned at around age 5, and was still occasionally tempted to forget. He made himself a sandwich, stood at the counter and ate it, and watched his daughter work through the problem in the particular way she always did, not checking the answer at the end, but going back through each step one at a time to make sure the logic held. "Done," she said, sitting back. She looked at him. "You seem better. I think things might be okay," he said. "Did you figure it out? Still figuring?" She nodded and picked up her pencil again to start the next problem. "That's okay," she said easily, like it was. "You always do." Seth looked at her bent head, the part in her dark hair, the tip of her tongue, showing slightly between her teeth the way it did when she was concentrating. 7 years of doing this without a net, without the person he had thought he'd do it with, without the safety margin that would have come from 2 incomes and 2 sets of hands and 2 people to take the weight when one of them couldn't. 7 years of knowing that the decisions he made were never just his, and trying to make them as though they were, because she didn't need to carry the weight of that. He hadn't always gotten it right. There had been months when the company nearly didn't make payroll. There had been nights when he sat in exactly the chair he was standing beside now and felt the full weight of the bet he was making with their life. But he had never made a decision he was ashamed of. He had never handed the thing he built to someone who didn't understand what it was for. That felt, standing in the kitchen on a Thursday night in October, with his daughter doing long division and the furnace making its sound in the basement, like something worth holding on to. The meeting with Reginald Aldercroft happened 10 days later, in a smaller room than the first one. A private meeting space in a hotel near Union Station, nothing like the theatrical architecture of the tower on the lake. Reginald came with Marcus and one advisor. He came without Constance, which Seth suspected was intentional, a signal of some kind about the register of this particular conversation. Seth came alone. He sat down before anyone gestured for him to sit, and he placed a folder on the table without opening it. And he looked at Reginald Aldercroft directly in a way that he had controlled more carefully in the first meeting. Reginald looked, Seth thought, slightly tired. Not diminished, the man was too controlled for that, but like someone who had run a calculation twice, and gotten a different answer the second time and found it interesting rather than alarming, because that was the kind of person he had spent 70 years becoming. "You have something we didn't fully understand," Reginald said. "Not a question." "I have something you didn't bother to understand," Seth replied evenly. "There's a difference." A small silence. Marcus looked at the table. Reginald's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but acknowledged the point. "What is it you want?" Reginald asked. Seth opened the folder and slid it across the table. "A partnership," he said. "Minority stake. Aldercroft gets distribution access and first right of refusal on future licensing deals. Bridgepath retains full operational control. My team stays intact. My name stays on the company." He paused. "And the pressure on my existing partners stops today, publicly through your lawyers, in writing." Reginald looked at the folder. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at Seth instead, and Seth let him look because there was nothing in his face that he was trying to hide. "You walked away from $4 million, Reginald said. Not accusatory, more like a man reviewing a fact he still found unusual. "You offered $4 million for something worth significantly more," Seth said. I walked away from a bad valuation. This time, the thing at the corner of Reginald's mouth was more clearly a smile. Small and reluctant and genuine, in a way that none of his expressions in the first meeting had been. He opened the folder. The negotiation that followed was real. No pleasantries, no performances, just two people who both understood what was on the table working through it with the particular focus that only comes when both sides have something to lose. Marcus spoke twice, both times usefully. The advisor made notes. Seth answered every question directly and conceded 3 minor points without resistance because they were genuinely minor, and held on 2 points that were not. At the end of 90 minutes, Reginald extended his hand. Seth shook it, not as a man who had been given something, as a man who had negotiated for something and received it on terms he could live with. There was a difference, and he felt it in the handshake itself, the particular quality of a grip between two people who now understood each other's weight. He took the elevator down alone. Outside, it had started to snow. The first real snow of the season early, the kind of wet, heavy flakes that stick immediately to everything and make the city look briefly like a different city, something quieter and less certain. Seth stood on the pavement and tipped his face up for a second, feeling the cold land on his skin, and let himself have 30 seconds of something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite triumph, but lived somewhere between the two, in the quieter territory of things that had been hard and were now not easy. But settled, his phone buzzed. A text from Rosie. "Dad, I made the B team for hockey. Can we celebrate with Thai food?" He stood in the snow outside Union Station with $4.2 million and a bad acquisition offer somewhere behind him and a partnership agreement worth considerably more somewhere ahead of him, and he typed back, "Yes, you picked the place." Then he started walking to his car. The weeks that followed were busy in a way that felt productive rather than desperate, which was a distinction he had learned to pay attention to. The Lakeshore deal closed. The integration layer launched to the 3 manufacturing partners who had been waiting for it, and the response was the kind that doesn't make noise publicly, but moves through an industry like a current. Quiet conversations, shifted priorities, calls from people he hadn't heard from in 2 years. The Aldercroft partnership agreement was finalized by the end of November, and Reginald sent a handwritten note with the signed copy that said simply, "You were right about the valuation." R.A. Seth kept it, not on display, but in a desk drawer where he'd know where to find it. The pressure campaign on his existing partners stopped as agreed, publicly in writing. Petra stopped looking tired, which was the metric Seth trusted most. And at home, which was where the real accounting happened, things were good in the simple, specific way that doesn't make for dramatic stories, but makes for actual life. Rosie made the B team and lost her second game and scored a goal in her third and told him afterward in the car, with her helmet still on for some reason, that she thought hockey was probably the best thing she'd ever tried. He agreed it seemed that way. He took her for Thai food 3 more times that month because it had become the victory meal, and she was racking up victories in the understated, accumulating way that 8-year-olds do when someone is paying attention to them. One evening in December, she came into his home office while he was finishing a call and sat cross-legged on the floor and waited, which she had learned to do without being asked, and when he hung up, she looked at him with the particular focused expression he'd come to recognize as her version of a serious question. "Dad," she said, "at school we have to say what our parents do. For a project." "What did you say?" She thought about it for a second. "I said you build things that help things move." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that right?" Seth leaned back in his chair and looked at her, this 8-year-old person who had arrived in the world 7 weeks early in a hospital in Hamilton during one of the worst winters on record, and had been from the very first moment completely and entirely herself. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." She nodded, satisfied, and unfolded herself from the floor and went back to whatever she had been doing before she remembered to ask. And Seth turned back to his screen, and the city glittered out the window in the December dark. And somewhere beneath the noise of it, beneath the contracts and the valuations, and the calculations about what things were worth and what they were for, was something that didn't have a number. He had always known it was there. He had just been waiting to prove to himself that it was stronger than the other kind. It was.